Hey, InterVarsity alumni. This is After 4, your podcast for navigating life after graduation. This is both an exciting and potentially tricky transition that you're making, and you might feel a little unsure about the coming weeks and months. We're here to provide you with expert advice, practical skills, and plenty of encouragement as you learn how to keep saying yes to Jesus in your new context. This is After 4, and this podcast is for you, alumni. What's up, alumni? Welcome to After 4, your podcast for navigating life after graduation. I'm your host and guide, John Steele, and we are kicking off a new series of episodes this week that have been designed to provide some healthy approaches to navigating conflict. But before we jump into that, let's enjoy another entry from our alumni yearbook. This week's entry comes from Carol Galambos, a UW-Milwaukee grad circa 1960. Friends, when someone with 64 years of life after college experience gives you advice, open your ears because you know it's time-tested and worth the investment. And Carol says, if I could suggest something to this year's grads, I'd say, number one, find a local church, join, bless it with your gifts, love the people in it, no matter how different from your IVCF small group, and stick with them. Number two, stay connected with InterVarsity friends. Maybe start a monthly fellowship and prayer for local university students group. And keep reading Ivy Press books. They are a steady lifeline to thoughtful biblical minds. That's how God has kept my faith fresh and growing for 64 years since I graduated from the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. Carol, thank you 1,000 times for writing in and sharing this advice. The encouragement to get involved at church is one that we hear pretty frequently, which tells me it's extremely important. But I think the encouragements to invest your gifts and not just consume, and to stick around even though it will be different from your chapter, are such important points to bring up. Because it's true, it won't be the same, and it really shouldn't be the same if we're honest, and that's a good thing. But it just takes time to adjust. And yes, keep reading those IVP books and use your alumni discount when you do it. Thanks again, Carol. And if any of you have some advice or encouragement that you'd like to give to a new grad, send us an email at alumni@intervarsity.org or a DM at After4Pod on Instagram. We would love to hear from you. All right, as I said, we're starting up a new series today. If you haven't already, at some point in the near future and numerous times after that, you're going to find yourself in the middle of some sort of conflict with someone or a group of someones. It could be a friendly but lively debate about your town's best pizza joint, a conversation I've found myself in numerous times, both in and out of school. Or it could be a topic that carries a lot more weight. Conflicts around the globe, political candidates, human sexuality, racism, and white supremacy, any number of complex topics. And for most of us, engaging in those conversations can understandably stir up a lot of emotions that can be difficult to know what to do with in the moment. And this isn't about judging our emotions necessarily, but about acknowledging the reality that sometimes we don't always respond to or engage in conflict in healthy ways. And the world around us certainly isn't giving us any good training on how to do this well today. So our hope over the coming weeks is that we can talk through some helpful skills and frameworks for learning how to navigate conflict and disagree well. And helping us kick off this series is Dr. John Inazu, the Sally D. Danforth Distinguished Professor of Law and Religion at Washington University in St. Louis, InterVarsity board member, and author of Learning to Disagree, The Surprising Path to Navigating Differences with Empathy and Respect. And John has some extremely helpful advice that you can start using right away the next time you experience conflict. So here's John, and this one's for you, alumni. John, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, John. It's great to be with you.
Always nice to chat with another John. Even if you do spell your name with an H, I can get over that and everything will be okay. Yes, John, excited to have you here today. As we get ready to jump in, would you please just give us a bit of an introduction, help our audience get to know you a little bit, John?
Sure. So I'm a law professor at Washington University in St. Louis and came to this position in a pretty nonlinear route. I went to college to study engineering, not because I liked it, but because the Air Force was paying for college and asked me to study
Okay.
engineering. I went to Duke and was part of InterVarsity as an undergraduate at Duke, and an engineering major begrudgingly. And so when I was finishing up college, I knew I did not want to be an engineer. And so I went to law school as an escape hatch. I didn't know any lawyers. I'd never spoken to a lawyer. I just knew it was not engineering, and ended up back at Duke for law school, and then went to practice law for about 5 years, went back and did a PhD when I knew I was sort of interested in law teaching. My PhD is in political theory, and then was very fortunate enough after lots of fits and starts and failures and misdirects to end up in a job in law teaching, which I love and which I've now been doing for 13 years. I live in St. Louis, Missouri. My wife, Caroline, and I have 3 kids who are 17, 15, and 11.
Wow. That's awesome. Well, and I think a huge encouragement for our primary audience to know that if you end up discovering that the thing that you spent all that time studying during undergrad isn't actually what you're super excited about or want to spend your time doing, that there's a lot of hope to find an alternate path afterwards.
Just to underscore that point, John, I look back at my life. There is no way I could have predicted what I'm doing right now, which is what I love what I do. And in some ways it plays to so many of my strengths and passions and gifts. And there's zero chance I could have predicted this route. And along the way to teaching law, I was a young life leader and a church high school youth pastor. And I had odd jobs and did temporary jobs and wasn't sure I'd ever be a professor. And at each twist and turn, you actually have no idea what comes next or whether it's going to work out. And then looking back, you can see, oh, there is God's faithfulness. And this is a piece of life maybe that I wouldn't have even chosen or wanted, but I can see now how it fits together. And that doesn't come without the ability to look back. And but I know so many people, myself included, when we look back, we just realize that it was nothing we could have planned on our own.
Absolutely. Yes. It is. It's nice to know that even if we don't see it in the moment, that the Lord wastes nothing, and that so many of those just seemingly random or unhelpful experiences, there can often be some threads that come out of those to sort of bring us to this place of, oh, okay, now that I look back, I can see the purpose that these serve to some degree. There's some of them that we probably will always wonder. That,
yes, indeed.
The Lord enjoys leaving a little mystery in our lives, and that's okay. John, you've also recently written a book, Learning to Disagree: The Surprising Path to Navigating Differences with Empathy and Respect. And I'm wondering, could you give us just a quick snapshot of that book?
Yeah, so this kind of came to me at the height of the pandemic when we were all socially distanced and people were just shouting at each other online, all of this outrage over COVID and different policies. And I was just thinking there has to be a better way to this. And it occurred to me that one of the tools or lenses to disagree better is through what I do, which is law and legal education. And I cover a lot of culture wars, hot button issues in classes like criminal law and law and religion. And I teach students how to engage with these empathetically and with nuance and in a listening way that lets you understand why the world is as complex as it is and why the other side is seldom just stupid and wrong, but might also just have a different way of seeing things. And so I thought, if I can channel some of this into a book in a narrative form that could reach people, not just in law school, but people who care about the Thanksgiving dinner table conversation or the neighborhood workplace, that this might be a set of resources that could be helpful. So this book ended up being a combination of those classroom vignettes, plus a bunch of examples in my own life when I totally failed at employing them in my relationships with family and friends. And it's sort of woven together in a year of my life narrative.
That's great. We're stepping into a new series here on After 4, and we are looking at conflict, dissonance, maybe even what we might consider engaging with our enemies in some ways, way, shape, or form. It's something that we're all going to have to do. It's just going to happen, but it's not easy to do well, and clearly that's something that you've given a lot of thought to. So I'm glad that you're here to kind of help us set the scene for these ideas. And oftentimes when I start off these conversations, I feel like I typically begin with a very obvious question. Today is no different than my normal chats with people. John, in your time with the topic, do you have insights, big picture, about just why we as humans tend to engage in conflict? Like, why is conflict itself such a prevalent thing? And then follow up question to that, as you're thinking, why is it so hard to do it in a healthy and productive way?
Yeah, I mean, so the reason for conflict, I think, is what scholars might call the fact of pluralism. In other words, we live in a world of profound differences over things that matter, and those differences are not going away. We might wish it differently, but it's the world we live in. So we might have actually an easier time of disagreement if we were all part of a homogenous society that had basically the same religion and same politics, but we don't. We're in the United States largely, people listening to this podcast, and we're in a country that is extremely divided over things that matter a great deal, about matters of eternity and faith, and matters of the purpose of this country, or what's the nature of a human being, or what is human flourishing. These are massive questions that have massive disagreements, and that creates conflict. It just is going to create conflict. So the question is not how do you avoid conflict, it's how do you deal with the reality of conflict. And then to the second question you asked, why are we so bad at it? Well, when you think about how we're formed as people, none of this comes easily. You can't just read a book and figure out how to do conflict well. You've got to practice it, and practice it in the right context. And many of us have been practicing conflict online, which has all of the wrong incentives of how to do this well. It's short and it's shrill, and it rewards performativity, and it's often disembodied with people we don't know. None of that is good for healthy conflict resolution. And the more we practice that, the more deformed we're going to be in our approach to conflict. That's part of it. Another part of it is, I think, with the changing demographics of our society, where so many people in this country are now rejecting transcendent faith of any kind, set aside Christianity, just faith at all. And if you live this life and think that all you have is this life, then the stakes are necessarily going to be very, very high. And every conflict takes on a kind of massive significance to it. And I think for many people, and I think many younger people right out of college might feel more apathetic about politics than anything. But for other demographics in this country, politics now has this transcendent weight to it that it can't possibly bear. And every election and every vote becomes life or death in a way that it wasn't meant to be, because people are coming into these conversations without any sense or hope for anything beyond it. So conflict is ratcheting up over the things that are not going away.
Yeah. That's really interesting that, as you're talking, it stands out to me that, something that I think many of us would consider a benefit, the fact that we have broader ideas, we have differing perspectives, like that can offer more context, that can offer more solutions to problems, by the fact that we don't all see things the same way, that's a good thing, that can be really helpful for us, but that's also the thing that brings about conflict just naturally, like good or bad conflict, whatever, that it brings it about. And that we don't engage with it well because we're not practicing the right way, like that we are practicing online, disembodied, quick shots fired, and then I don't have to look at it again.
Yeah, and I think, some difference in the world is good. It makes the world more interesting. So the fact that we might like different sports teams or have different food preferences, those are good things. And then sometimes our lived experiences give us different perspectives that can be extremely healthy in a team environment. So at a school or in a workplace, when you're trying to solve a problem and you have different perspectives and viewpoints, those can be great. And sometimes too much homogeneity can lead to blind spots and uncreative thinking. So there's a way in which lots of difference in this world is great, but we can all think of difference that is just not great, but harmful, right?
Yes.
It's not good that some people out there think that you should abuse children. It's not great that some people reject the possibility of God. So there are, differences in this world that obviously matter and are not neutral and are not just fun differences to have that make us all more interesting.
Yes. And then you also said the fact that there is less focus, less buy-in to sort of this transcendent faith, that we have these really big questions. We are looking for hope. We are looking for answers. And if we're not looking for it there, then we're going to put the weight of those answers on something that can't bear it. And in our current context, so often that's something like politics and a number of other things. But that is a really interesting insight that I had not considered, that if we're not putting our hope in something that can bear the weight of our hope, then we're going to put it in something that is going to shatter underneath it. And that's going to cause a lot of unhealthy conflict as a result.
Well, I mean, think about it, whether you're of faith or not, you go through this world, and this is especially true when you're young, although it just appears in a different format when you get older. But you go through this world wanting to avoid fear and pain and wanting to maximize control and security. That's just very human. And then you encounter experience after experience where you realize, oh, I can't do this on my own. I do actually experience and encounter fear and pain, and there's no way to avoid it. And as much as I want to control and have security, whether it's financial or career or family or relationship, that is ultimately partial and unfulfilling. And so then what do? Well, if you find faith, that's a pretty amazing antidote to both fear and control. And if you don't, you double down often on the fear and control. And then today, there are quite a few people who have found faith but aren't practicing the hope that it brings, who are themselves wedded to that same fear and control. It's a very human temptation. It's completely understandable why people experience it. But the result that points towards something just of this world, like politics or money or family or friends, are inevitably going to let us down.
John, the subtitle of your book is The Surprising Path to Navigating Differences with Empathy and Respect. So what is it about empathy and respect that make them necessary for navigating differences, and what makes you say that they're surprising?
Yeah, I mean, important because they're kind of the whole ball game to the predicate of disagreement. In other words, if you can't figure out a way to empathize with someone, if you can't actually respect the person, even while disagreeing with their ideas, then at best you're going to come to that passive aggressive point of agree to disagree, right? Which is actually not healthy disagreement. It's just saying we can't talk about it. And what I'm arguing for, not achieving consensus, because we will still have that disagreement, but learning to disagree in a healthier and more human way. And that is contingent on these practices of empathy and respect. What's surprising about them? Well, part of the book's argument is the surprising and counterintuitive suggestion that you might get some of this from lawyers, who are the people we tend to think of as not very empathetic and not very respectful, but actually the best kind of law and the best kind of lawyer teaches you how to do this well, and that there are some ideas and practices to learn from the law. But then also surprising in the sense that much of this reduces to almost common sense things that we know from early on in our childhood. The importance of being kind and compassionate and listening to people and slowing down, the importance of patience. We all learned these things, and we just find them incredibly hard to put into practice. And so what's surprising is, none of this is rocket science. It's the kind of thing that we have to be reminded of and that we have to work at very diligently, but it's available to all of us. And particularly when we pursue it together in relationship and community.
It is surprising to think that so often the best options for pursuing these things in a healthy way, pursuing anything in a healthy way, not just conflict, but any healthy thing, is returning to sort of the fundamentals, the basics that our parents were raising. Like, this is how you successfully develop relationships at school with your classmates, is by doing these things in first grade. This is going to make you successful. It's going to help your classmates and your teachers all like you. This is really good. And it's just funny to think that sort of a a matured version of that is really the application that we need for being able to engage in conflict well as adults. And that so much of that comes from, as you say, empathy. Like, what does it look like for me to put myself in the shoes of another person, to consider their argument, their experiences, why they hold to the things that they do, not to bring consensus necessarily so that we suddenly agree, but now we can disagree with understanding and with respect, and not just agree to disagree. I'm done talking to you about this.
Yeah, if the U.S. Congress could come anywhere close to a moderately healthy third grade classroom, we'd be in great shape.
Yes, that would be phenomenal. Well, okay, so then let's talk about a few of those things, John. I mean, one of the things that I want for us to do here as our alumni are listening in is for them to feel like they can walk away with some things that help them start to put this into practice. Now, I want people to still be excited to buy and read your book. So, don't give away all of your punchlines here, all of your best material. But I mean, can you give us a couple of practical steps that alumni could start engaging with today as they're driving to work and preparing for a conversation with their boss or people on their team or their pastor at church or whatever it might be? Like, what are some practical steps that we could start taking on today to cultivate healthy, productive conflict and disagreement?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I'm going to give you two super practical tips. One,
Great.
If you know you have to have that hard conversation or that conversation across disagreement, make sure you're going into it on a full tank, right? Make sure that you've prayed about it, that you're not sleep deprived, that you're yourself in a good emotional state. And this is also one of the reasons why, when it comes to family relationships, don't try to have this over Thanksgiving, right? Don't have it on top of an already complex and high stakes reunion. Find a time in an ordinary setting. Maybe it means you've got to plan another trip home or see a friend outside of a high stakes event, but do this in an ordinary setting where you go in with a full tank and you're prepared to what inevitably are going to be some hard words, some offensive statements. Be ready to take some of those hits. Have a bit of a thicker skin going in, which you can only do if you're prepared for and ready for the conversation. So that's practical tip number one. Practical tip number two, and especially if you're right out of college, you will understand this intuitively. The best conversations and the hardest discussions do not happen in rooms full of people. They do not happen in 300-person lecture halls or in company-wide meetings. They happen around small tables with small groups of people. Maybe it's just a meal with a friend. Maybe it's 4 people grabbing dessert. Maybe it's a seminar class that you took in college. And you know this from experience, that those are the possibilities that generate the best possible conditions for these hard conversations. So then you might say, well, how can I recreate this in the busyness of life that is no longer college? I mean, I used to think college was busy, but now I'm out there and realize, oh, I had more time than I thought I did. So What do you do then? Well, I would suggest this. You're not going to be able to recreate a seminar unless you find yourself in graduate school, I suppose. But what you can do is find a small group of friends and commit to 5 or 6 meetings in person. And focus it on one issue. Maybe you pick up this book and work through the reflection guide at the end of the book, but maybe you want to talk about immigration or criminal justice reform. So find one issue and commit to 5 or 6 meetings and, bring good food and make sure people aren't super time constrained. But the key to those meetings in sequence is you can come to that first one and spend some time trust building and talking through the issue. But then you leave and you commit to do some reading and thinking and praying in between. And when you come back, you've got a little more trust, a little more sophistication, a little more nuance, and you can talk about the issue with a little more depth and rinse and repeat 5 or 6 times with the same group of people. And then you can kind of show yourself, you know what? We can do this. We don't just have to be in college to do this. We can make and create spaces in the busyness of life with people around us to do this and do it well. And then we can model this for other people because we are all aware of the social and cultural and political challenges writ large, but those aren't going to change unless we are making small changes on very granular levels. And we do that by starting with the people around us.
And even taking a step back from that to your first point of starting sort of internally of am I emotionally ready to step into this conversation in this moment? I have found the number of times that somebody has sent me a text or an email or a Facebook message that I didn't like what they had to say. The best decision that I made that day was to delete the response that I was about to send in the moment because I was not ready. That's certainly one of the beauties of if we will take advantage of it, one of the beauties of all of our electronic communication is I can think 2 or 3 times before I respond. And that gives me an opportunity, one, to rest up, to think, and then maybe to, rather than sending that response at all a day later, is just to say, hey, could we actually sit down for some coffee and talk through this together? Because I think that might be helpful. Because also the number of times that people clarify for me and I realize that I was misinterpreting an electronic communication. I was adding tone of voice that wasn't there. I was adding facial movements that weren't there, body language that wasn't there. To sit down and have that conversation with somebody in real life or with a group of people that we trust together. I can think of very few situations where that backfired on me and where that wasn't the best move.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And maybe to come at that same point from a different angle, we know we're called to speak the truth in love. That's not optional, but I would say that the necessary condition all the time is to speak in love.
Yes.
And sometimes we don't have to speak. And so if we're called, if we're called to speak, we have to speak truthfully, but we don't have to speak in every single instance. And sometimes the loving thing to do is not to speak. It's better. It's more loving to God. It's more loving to ourselves. It's more loving to the person who has just messaged us on social media. And to act in love can also be not to speak.
Yes. An opportunity to do unto others as I would have them do unto me. It's like if the roles were reversed here, would I rather that somebody pounced on the thing that I just said, or that they would give it a moment? And maybe now's an opportunity for me to respond lovingly by not speaking. John, we've talked about the practical. I wonder, do you have even a final pastoral word of encouragement for people who are, our young alumni, first year of life after graduation, there is so much that's going on. Talk about the difficulty of stepping into a moment like this when your tank is full. How often do you feel like you can get a full tank at all when there's so many new things that are coming around the corner for you, and then boom, you find yourself in conflict? So, final pastoral encouragement that you might have for our first year out alumni who are stepping into the unknown in so many ways, and that conflict is going to be a part of that unknown.
Yeah, two related points here. One is there's so much, I think, helpful passion and energy in Gen Z and in recent graduates. And I work with many of these people on my own campuses, many of like your listeners. And I think understandably and sometimes very rightfully, there is a concern about existing institutions, whether in politics or education or the church or journalism. And many of our institutions are in disarray. But I would say this, it takes an institution to beat an institution.
Wow.
So long-term change and long-term movement toward a more just, a more flourishing set of institutions will require you to invest in institutions. It might take new ones, but it might take investing in old ones. And that takes a lot of time, a lot of commitment, and a lot of effort. So choose a lane and invest in the long game and invest in institutions. And then the related point is, know that you are playing a very, very long game, and you might not even be around to see the fruits of your own labor. And that's okay, because as Christians, you're part of a story that unfolds over many thousands of generations. And you and I get to have this conversation today because of the faithfulness of people who have gone long before us. Andy Crouch has made this point in his most recent book, and I think it's very important to recognize that we are bit players in a very long game. And what a privilege and what a joy that is. But that's also quite freeing because it takes the pressure off of us. We are called to be faithful in this moment, to work hard, to love God, to love neighbor, and he will take care of the rest.
Thank goodness. And even in the times when we totally botch it,
exactly.
That he's still there at work in those places. John, this has been incredibly encouraging. I'm grateful, so grateful for your ability to take something that feels like an overwhelming topic and to take us back to the basics and say it's actually these things. Let's get back to the basics, back to the fundamentals. John, how can we make space for people to keep engaging with the work that you're doing? Where can they find your book? And are there other things that you've been working on that people could engage with to keep learning about these things with you?
Great, thanks. So a couple of things. If the book Learning to Disagree, you can buy it anywhere, and would love for people to engage with it and engage with the reflection guide at the end. I have a weekly Substack called Some Assembly Required that is free, and you're welcome to sign up for that. And then if you are out there listening and considering law school or thinking about being a lawyer, check out the Legal Vocation Fellowship, which is a new initiative that some friends and I are working on, focused on formation and discipleship in the legal practice.
That's fantastic. We'll make sure that those things make it into the show notes so that people can just click and start reading. John, thank you so much for joining me today. This has been so great, really helpful, very encouraging. And to talk about a conversation like conflict and to walk away feeling encouraged, that's a win. So thanks a lot. I know that you have a lot going on, and I appreciate you giving time to me, but more importantly, giving time to our alumni as they navigate this new season of life.
Thanks, John. It's been great to talk to you.
So one of the explicit purposes of this podcast, and I mentioned this in the introduction, is to provide you with useful skills and frameworks for navigating life after graduation. And even this series in particular has been developed to provide you with practical skills for healthy conflict. What's funny to me is that so much of John's advice from today and so many of the things that we need to navigate conflict and disagreement well aren't new skills at all. We're not imparting you with anything you haven't heard before. Turns out, according to John, the skills we need for stepping into healthy conflict are all things that we learned as kids. And when we do those things, when we go back to our third grade interpersonal relationship skill sets, we are setting ourselves up to be able to learn to disagree in healthy, humble ways that might actually result in empathy and respect rather than frustrated polarization. Not necessarily so that we'll come to an agreement with somebody that we're in conflict with, but in an effort to navigate disagreement in a way that helps us remember that there's another person, an image bearer of God, on the other side of the conversation. And I just can't help but wonder, how might that reality impact the way that we engage in conflict with one another? So, alumni, when you find yourself standing toe-to-toe with someone with whom you strongly disagree, remember to lean into kindness and compassion, to listen patiently, and to slow down to a pace that makes all of those things more possible. Even if it means pushing pause and saying, hey, can we come back to this tomorrow over a cup of coffee, just the two of us, after we've had some time to rest and reset a bit? You can't control the other person's response in these moments, but you can certainly set yourself up well for showing empathy and respect, even in the midst of significant disagreement. John, thanks so much for joining us today and for helping us kick off this series. I am really glad that we were able to land on some simple skills, although maybe not always easy skills, that can help us navigate healthy conflict. We are really grateful for you, John. Alumni, come back next week for my conversation with Caroline Lancaster. She's going to reintroduce us, or for some of us, introduce us for the first time, to the Approaching Differences diagram. The diagram is a helpful tool for processing and navigating dissonance when we're crossing cultures, and I think that we're going to find that it has some really useful application in broader contexts and broader experiences with conflict and disagreement. Thanks for tuning in, and I will see you in the after, alumni. Hey, thanks so much for joining us today, alumni. If there was anything that you learned, really enjoyed, or that encouraged you from today's episode, would you send us a DM or tag us in a story? We'd love to hear about it. You can find us at After4Pod on Instagram and Facebook. And if you haven't already, take just a second to unlock your phone and subscribe to the podcast. If your platform lets you, leave us a rating and a review. And if you like what we're doing here, share us with your InterVarsity or other post-graduation friends. Thanks again for listening, and I will see you in the after, alumni.